It is 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Edgar Zazwata, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. We are so happy to have you after a week off. Go ahead and jump into the chat, say hello. Let us know where you're watching from today, just so all of you guys know. Edgar and I have legitimately been in these seats for already an hour plus because we are just moving over from the 2021 virtual ACSA Personnel Institute. So I gave Edgar exactly about 3 minutes to run to the restroom, eat something, and answer emails. Edgar, that was a really, really good program that we were on at the Personnel Institute.
Yeah, and for a second, I thought you were going to complain about being in the chair for an hour, but I was going to say, yeah, it's time well spent talking to our members. I mean, that was a great conversation about some issues that, we're going to talk here about in terms of some of the challenges that folks are facing with obviously with the pandemic, with some trying to navigate some of the changes. But yeah, no, I agree. It was a great conversation and appreciated being able to be part of that program.
Yeah, and Laura Dutch, our very first person on the chat today. What's funny is that you and I were talking about how, okay, we took a week off, but then when we come back, they make us do 2 shows. Not that it's a problem. Somehow you and I got enough content in there to fill an hour, but it is funny that you take a week off and then they pour a little bit more on for you.
Hey, like I said earlier, just the fact that people even notice that whether we're here or not, I think that's pretty cool, right? That when we get emails about, hey, what happened to your show, whatnot. Yeah, I appreciate that people are even noticing when we're not here.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. Ellen Wheeler, Deanna, so good to see you. Marie Russell and Jamie Green. Maura, so good to have you on the show. We've got Dr. Naomi Bardach, who's going to be on the show in a couple of minutes, the testing lead on the Safe Schools for All team and the State Department of Health and Human Services to talk about that October 15th deadline. Edgar, I do want to address a couple of news pieces that we have. San Diego Union Tribune reporting this morning, San Diego Unified will now mandate COVID vaccines by December 20th for staff and eligible students 16 and older. Again, by December 20th. Edgar, we're seeing this pop up in other places. And then it was reported in the Bee yesterday that it seems like maybe there's some discussion about this possibly happening in other school districts. But let's address LA Unified did something like this. Now San Diego Unified. Obviously, this type of discussion is happening in so many school communities.
Yeah, as we've seen with many of these initiatives and efforts, it kind of has a domino effect. Not to say that this is going to necessarily happen across the board as a local decision. And I know we're going to get a question, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about some of the discussions happening out there about potential state action. But yeah, to your point, some LEAs are moving in the direction of really thinking about, is this something that we just want to institute ourselves? Right now, it's been concentrated mostly in some of our bigger urban districts. I know because we've received some of the comments on this show about different perspectives. We get the states very diverse and have different considerations depending on the community folks come from. But yes, I expect that this is just the beginning, and there may be other school districts that move in this direction as they have these conversations locally with their partners, with their employees, with their families. In this case, we're talking about students. So I think we probably will have more to see on this front.
And let me bring up one other piece that was out there. This was as reported by our friends over at EdSource on the 27th about chronic absenteeism surging since schools reopened. They talked a little bit about the issues due to stay-at-home quarantines, fear of COVID, general disengagement with school. They did highlight the numbers for 4 districts, Edgar, and I'll have you just kind of respond to this. Chronic absenteeism. Stockton Unified, 39%, Oakland Unified, 33%, Elk Grove Unified, 26%, Thermalito Union Elementary School, 46%. There are myriad factors that could be playing into this, but chronic absenteeism is something that we've seen so many school districts just in a huge effort, try and push back and get those numbers to improve. Seeing something like this, Edgar, I'm interested at your thoughts on what could be contributing to this, because we can, when I talked to educators yesterday, some of it could be the modified quarantine, some of it could be the independent study and the lack of distance learning. We've heard about staffing issues, so there is possibly that. What are you seeing when you see a story like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's consistent with some of the anecdotes that we've heard from our members in previous weeks. And I think it's a combination of factors. I think you alluded to it. I think it's one, now that we are coming back from the pandemic and we have in-person instruction as kind of the default mode of instruction there's still some angst, and we're seeing it in some families, right? Still not wanting to go to school on a regular basis. I think the articles talked about that there's still some hesitancy, and maybe because of virtual learning or what some students had experienced over the last couple of years, some families just got out of sync of like the norm of going to school every day, right? So there's that. You mentioned the quarantine issues. I think it gets complicated with some of the state rules that if you don't get all of the appropriate documentation back, if you don't get all the work back, then that student can be counted as absent. So that's a contributing factor. And I think there's something also on the public health side, right, where we're still being, schools are still under the old system of attendance, right, that you get docked, or you lose funding for every day a student's not there. Now, as our guest would attest to, Dr. Bardach and all the public health folks, I think some of the messaging has also been, wait a minute, but if your child's not feeling well, if you're showing any symptoms, whether you think it's COVID or not, err on the side of safety there and don't send your kid to school. So I think that's, some of that challenge that we have, where some parents are keeping their kids at home when they think they may be coming down with the cold or whatnot, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is, how do we reconcile that with our state accountability system and our attendance system? I think there's a myriad of issues here, I think, that are contributing to this.
Yeah, and I would ask for our commenters, for our viewers, if you wouldn't mind dropping this into the comment section about maybe some challenges with updating the COVID dashboards, because we've heard of some districts struggling to be able to update some of those based on schools or on districts. We're interested to hear about any of the successes and challenges that you are having with updating your COVID dashboard. So go ahead if you have a chance and drop that into the chat. All right, let's go ahead and let's transition here, because we do have that October 15th deadline coming up for the mandate for educators to be vaccinated or to submit to testing. We do have Dr. Naomi Bardach. She is the testing lead on the Safe Schools for All team, State Department of Health and Human Services. She is with us probably more often than she likes to be with us, but she is with us again today. Dr. Bardach, it is so good to see you again. Let me just go back to August 11th, if I can. Director of State Public Health Officer at CDPH issued public health order on vaccine verification for workers in schools. For our administrators, that October 15th deadline is fast approaching, a mere couple of weeks away. And according to the order, educators must prove that they are fully vaccinated or must submit to that diagnostic screening test. So can you walk us through the order at what needs to take place ahead of that October 15th deadline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you sort of summarized the sort of very core pieces of that order, which is that the sort of rationale behind it is to support people to get vaccinated. It creates a really key layer of safety around the schools. It's good for protecting the people who get vaccinated. And so that's sort of the goal behind it. And in the earlier part of the show, you guys were talking about the fact that many people around the state, schools, school districts, people around the country actually are talking about doing even more structured mandates where people are required to be having their vaccines in order to be working in the school context, et cetera. So that's sort of the context of the order, and then the sort of implementation of it is the vaccine verification, meaning that people have to show that they're a verification that they've been fully vaccinated by October 15th, or a school should have set up testing there should be a system set up into place where there is weekly testing of those unvaccinated school workers in order for them to continue to work on campus and in the school environment, whether it's on campus or off campus. But if they're interacting with people in person, particularly students, then they should be getting either vaccine verification or the testing being done once a week.
Dr. Bardach, first of all, big thank you. We don't keep tallies on this. Well, we might, maybe our team behind the scenes, but you might be in the lead for most appearances on this show. That probably means two things. There's been a lot of need for support in the field, and that probably means that you've been very busy as well, just over your time here. And I know, we'll get to this later, but I know you're transitioning back to your regular practice here after this week at UCSF. But just thank you for all the support you've provided the field. It goes without saying, a very difficult time. So just thank you for always saying yes to us as well.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's such an important partnership, actually, between education and public health. And so it's deeply appreciative, actually, of all the work that you guys are doing and the partnership together. So
thank you. Thank you for that. One of the things I was going to ask you about, I know there was some updates, and this could get lost in the shuffle because I feel like some of our folks feel like they're always drinking out of the fire hose, and there is always information. So one of our objectives here is to kind of help try to translate. We know CDPH released a few updates to the school guidance last week. So we're just hoping you could maybe just touch on that and walk through what some of those changes were.
Yeah, and they're relatively minor in some ways. There's just two very specific pieces. And they're minor in some ways in terms of numbers of words involved, but they do have some implications on the implementation side on how we do things. So the one key piece is that when we talk about the shortened duration of quarantine, that is, it's item number 9 in the school's guidance. There's a piece that says that anybody who tests, if you're testing on day 5 or after, you can come back to be out of quarantine after day 7. That's the new language. It used to be that it had to be the test was after day 5. Now the language says it can be on or after day 5 in order to become back out of quarantine after day 7. So that it was that difference. Now the testing can happen on day 5 instead of only after day 5. Small change in language, but very big difference in some ways in terms of implementation. And that's just to clarify, the counting of the days is from the day of exposure for that person who got quarantine, who's in quarantine, the last day they were exposed until day 5, they can get their test, and then they can come back after day 7. So that was one language change. The other language change is very specific to the pooling program. Anybody who's doing testing, a testing type called pooling testing, which is PCR, but it looks at a group of swabs all together in one pool. And that basically says that you can use the pooling for testing any student who's in modified quarantine. So that was just clarifying the language that people who are doing modified quarantine, who are part of the pooling program, can use the pooling for their modified quarantine testing.
Dr. Bardach, let me just follow up on that, just to put a spotlight on it, especially on the first change. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the objective here is to try to get kids back in, especially in this modified quarantine, trying to keep them in school, right? Or trying to get them, when eligible, to make sure that we can keep them receiving instruction, right? So making it somewhat easier in terms of when we can test them when they're eligible to essentially stay or get out of quarantine, I guess, in this case, right?
That is exactly right. And I'll say one other thing, which is it's also that the CDC changed that language. So instead of saying, they used to say after day 5, the test has to happen after day 5, and then they changed their language to say on or after day 5. CDPH therefore also changed their language, and the school's guidance also changed its language. So that's the other piece of context. But absolutely, the overall goal is to support students to be in-person instruction and in a safe way.
Just want to remind all of you at home that if you have questions for Dr. Bardach, go ahead and throw those onto our chat today so we can make sure we get as many questions answered before Dr. Bardach transfers out of this position, and then we're never allowed to talk with her again. So go ahead and get all of them in. Dr. Bardach,
there will be other people coming in to take my place.
No. Look, the moment you transition, we're done. We're not having this. We're not going to discuss this. COVID ends the second that you transition out of this position. You were talking about testing options, PCR, antigen, pool. Can you talk in a broad sense about what the state has made available to school districts, and are any of these options free to the school districts, and where should administrators go to really evaluate the various options?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Great questions. So the school testing program, the state K through 12 school testing program, provides free testing to K through 12 schools throughout the state of California, public and private. It's funded by state dollars, and also the CDC sent a lot of dollars actually to all states throughout the nation. California Department of Public Health received in April $887 million specifically for K through 12 testing. LA Department of Public Health has a separate pot of dollars of $300 million to support also the K through 12 testing. And in using those dollars, there's free testing that's available either for schools who want to do what's called PCR testing, which is one-to-one PCR testing, or something called antigen testing, or that thing that I mentioned before called pooled PCR testing. For people who want to learn more about those different types of testing, they can go to the testing website. It's called the Testing Task Force, or you can do CDPH testing for schools. It's a school testing website that will explain the difference between those programs, but also very importantly, you can put in an interest form, and then people can come to office hours. For schools, they do it twice a week, office hours, where you can just ask questions, hear more about those programs. And you can also read on that website all the materials that sort of explain what those programs are about, and help people to think through, like, what would it look like if I had a testing program at my school? How often might I be testing? Would the people who get tested, are they symptomatic? Are they not symptomatic? Are they vaccinated? Or are they not vaccinated? Just helping people think through the strategy. That website has a lot of really good information on it. And the last thing I'll say is that the free part of it covers software that is actually a really key piece operationally for people. It's for registering people who are participating, consenting them. If the parent has to give consent, they can do it through the software. Also reporting back, and both to the school, to the family, to public health. So that software is really important. And then it gives you the test kits, it gives you shipping if it's PCR. So it really provides a lot of those wraparound pieces. And the only piece that is not covered by those dollars for like sort of across the board is the people who have to do the collecting of the test. So some schools on an equity basis can get additional support for the person part, for the collecting of the test, but the school program writ large is very, very free, except for that personnel piece is not always covered. So hopefully that gives you the general sense.
Dr. Bardach, because you've been a frequent guest, that we love asking questions that sometimes you cannot answer, but it's our job to ask them anyway. So here's a shot. Here's my shot today. Obviously, Dr. Galley and the governor have made some headlines over the last week talking about the potential of making vaccinations a requirement in schools for those over 12, going even further than what we've been talking about. And I think the comments that have been made is that it's on the table, that this is something soon. Anything that you could, talk to us more about potential time frame? What are some of the considerations? What do we know what the process may look like here in terms of going that from being a consideration to potentially having something that's implemented here in the state?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple key pieces that are helpful to highlight. California historically has had a very strong vaccination program in schools, supporting students to be vaccinated in order to be able to attend school. That's sort of something that's been part of California's sort of approach to public health and vaccinations in general in schools. That being said, COVID is actually a little bit different. And I just want to highlight that we know that adults are often, they tend to get sick with COVID more often, and they tend to transmit it more effectively than students. So it's really helpful to remember that the vaccine mandate conversation also, we have to change our mindset a little bit to remember that there's an adult component that that is an important thing just to highlight, that if we just say, oh, all the kids have to get vaccinated and we forget about the adults, then that's actually not going to be as effective as making sure we think about it in a broad kind of way. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is that vaccines mandates for students, there's definitely some considerations around the type of approval that has been already sort of, what the approval looks like from the FDA, because there's two types of approval. One is called emergency use authorization, which is the first stage of approval. It's a relatively rigorous approval process, but it's usually done earlier in the stage when you're looking at a vaccine compared to full authorization, FDA authorization. And so the vaccine has full FDA authorization for 16 and up, but for the younger age groups, it's still under the emergency use authorization. Sorry, it has full FDA approval for 16 and up, but it's still under what they call the EUA for younger students. And so where we are in the approval process is probably also, it's something that people are talking about as would be one of the considerations and one of the decision factors about how much to say people have to get a vaccine versus not. So those are some of the sort of the broad considerations that hopefully gives some people some understanding of how that decision might be discussed. But as Dr. Galley has mentioned and Governor Newsom, it's something that's actively part of the discussion, not just, for the state of California, it's national, it's happening in some of the school districts already, but it's a discussion. So there's no sense of like, oh, there's a definite action in one way or the other.
Marie Russell, I see your question about an extracurricular activity. I'm going to go ahead and transition over to an extracurricular activity question. Then Edgar, if you want to toss in Marie's question. Dr. Bardach, is after school care considered an extracurricular activity? Because we've heard that after school care does qualify for modified quarantine requirements if the kids are exposed there. But it's a little bit unclear right now if after school care is something that the students are supposed to abstain from. So can you clarify if after school care is indeed an allowable activity for a student who's on modified quarantine?
Mm-hmm. So the guidance isn't totally specific on this point. So different health jurisdictions are interpreting it slightly differently. And so I can give you the spirit of the guidance and sort of how people interpret it. And then it might be that local context is going to kind of drive this particular sort of nuance. The general idea is to support kids to be able to sort of be in in-person instruction. After school care, has this very weird definition. Sometimes it's covered actually with educational dollars, and there's like extended day programs that are truly sort of based in the educational fabric of how things get funded, et cetera. So some local health jurisdictions are saying that counts. And if you're mask on mask in that context and you're supervised by an adult, sure, modified quarantine, you should use that. It's on a school, campus and whatever. So they're interpreting it that way. But like the after school ballet class that's like totally off campus and a totally different thing, that counts as more of an extracurricular activity. So there was no like perfect way to define this versus that. And local health jurisdictions are making some of their own decisions about that. But in general, I think that the interpretation of something that looks more like school and supports families to have their kids, have the care that they need in an after-school setting, and it's well supervised by adults and blah, blah, blah. It feels like that would make sense to me also to have a modified quarantine approach, but it's going to be different depending on how people interpret it.
Dr. Bardach, I'll follow up with you're used to answering questions about face coverings, and no surprise we had a couple questions. One, Marie asked specifically about maybe using testing as a means to not have, in this case, basketball players wear masks, given some of the challenges. So I'll throw that out there, but also kind of this bigger question of, I think it was Shelley who asked, is there any metrics that are being developed on how to phase out masks in schools? I think the last order said that it would be evaluated in November, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So just generally speaking, how is the state approaching this whole issue of face coverings?
Mm-hmm. So just very briefly on the basketball piece. So there's no part of the guidance that says if you do weekly testing that therefore you don't have to do a mask requirement. And that's just based on the fact that we know masks are really helpful at decreasing the spread, and that a lot of the transmission that we've seen actually in youth tends to be in sports related outbreaks. And so so the weekly testing is not something that is an option unless it's truly a mask creates that choking hazard or an activity can't be done without a mask. So so that's sort of the guidance right there. And then in the November sort of one reconsideration of the masking guidance, looking at that masking guidance, what are the metrics that we're trying to look at are the ones that are basically sort of the part of the public health framing of this would be things that will probably sound familiar to people, which is what are our community case rates looking like? So when we wrote that guidance, it was kind of before the Delta surge. So we had that huge Delta surge. Now things are getting better, which is like a total blessing when we look at the California numbers. But community case rates, definitely something that we'll be looking at. Vaccination rates, and then where are we in terms of vaccine approval for younger ages is the other thing, because part of the goal of the masking is to put a protective layer around those who are unvaccinated. Our children in elementary school settings are the largest group of unvaccinated people in the state of California because they're not eligible for it yet. So those are the pieces that we're balancing, as well as, of course, looking to see how things went in the beginning part of the year in terms of school transmissions, et cetera.
Dr. Bardach, Carol Burke-Bray asked the question, can you clarify individuals recovered more than 90 days earlier do not waive the testing requirement? Can this be interpreted to mean that anyone who tests positive for COVID are exempt from weekly testing for 90 calendar days? Can you clarify that?
I would have to get back to you about that just to double check on following that whole question, because I don't want to give the wrong answer without making sure I've looked at that language carefully. Is that okay? Can I would be happy to get back individually to that question, both individually, and then also you guys can then give the answer next week.
Yes.
Okay. A quick testing question, Dr. Bardach. I think Don asked a question about saliva testing option, and is they considering this as one of the options to make it more readily available and free? And I think was the specific question.
Oh, meaning is saliva-based testing going to become part of the program? Yeah. We have not gone down that route particularly because just by hook or by crook, it's not exactly been something that we've gone down too much. The general experience across the schools environment, both nationally and sort of at the state level, is that saliva-based testing would be fine. The biggest thing about the saliva-based testing, there's two things. One of which is it looked great before when everybody had to do that nasal pharyngeal one, the really deep one, terrible. Now that we can do anterior nares, which means front of the nose only, the kid can do it themselves, supervised self-collection. Basically, it's like, I joke, but not so much. Kind of a joke, but not really. It's like picking your nose with a Q-tip, and kids are really good at picking their noses, and so they're actually oftentimes very good at doing this particular type of collection. And the other piece is that saliva is actually, it takes a fair amount of time to collect, and then also sometimes you have goldfish crackers in your saliva collection because they're kids and they had a snack 2 minutes ago. So all of those reasons are why it's not like a big part of the state testing program. There are schools who use it sometimes successfully. It tends to be more in the college crowd, actually, that saliva-based testing really got popular.
I'm going to ask you to forecast just a little bit. So the crystal ball, if you may. As we head into the fall, I know there are places that are running the dual COVID-19 and flu shot clinics. Do you feel hopeful about where the numbers are in California Or do you think we might be heading into a difficult time because we've got the winter season with the flu season coming up, and we're still trying to confront the challenges with COVID-19 vaccines and distribution?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the fall looks like? What do you foresee for California Department of Public Health moving forward?
So what I'm hearing is that it's actually of a broader question. It's not just schools. Am I right in hearing that it's more like the big picture across the state?
I would say, yeah. I think more. Well, what do we see? In terms of just a broader forecast, given all the good news that California has, and then how do we see that impacting our school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the overall. This is a super hard crystal ball question. I'm relatively hopeful that we are in a good space now. There's definitely the influenza piece is really important for reducing the risk of overwhelming our hospital system. So getting the adults vaccinated against flu, as well as getting the kids vaccinated against flu, like all of that will help basically keep the flu hospitalizations down, which means we will be less likely to be overwhelmed in the hospital system in general, which has implications for people doing well if they get hospitalized for COVID or for anything else. So that's one piece. I know there's a huge push. The messaging is like pretty consistent, and hopefully people are responding to that. I definitely am seeing that in the healthcare space where, healthcare workers are getting vaccinated against influenza, also against COVID, et cetera. And we're continuing to message that to our families also about influenza vaccine being super important. So that's all good news. If we haven't, the masking, funkily enough, right? If you guys remember last year, we didn't actually have very much influenza. We didn't have very much of the other childhood viruses, partly because everybody was masking or staying at home. So hopefully those masks actually are going to help in addition, as well as then all the partnership that schools have to do vaccine clinics, both for COVID and then sometimes doing influenza at the same time. So that partnership with schools is going to be super helpful. And then the masking actually can really potentially also help everybody stay not sick with all of those other viruses that we normally get.
I'm still sitting here on your saliva and goldfish comment, Dr. Bardach, because I immediately thought about my wife, the kindergarten teacher, and how that's like exactly the type of life she would lead is saliva and goldfish crackers. That's exactly what it would be. Hey, before you leave, we know that you're transitioning, but you've been on our show so much. And the last time you came on, we said you've been on here so often that we just need to give you ACSA business cards. So we actually took the step of creating an ACSA business card for you. Dr. Naomi Bardach, health expert and frequent ACSA show guest. So now it's almost like you're an employee with us.
Awesome. I am thrilled and I am happy to serve. So thank you guys.
I'm not exactly sure what it'll get you. Maybe, it's like in Monopoly, if you get out a free jail card. I don't know. But, I would keep it in your back pocket. You never know where it might come in handy.
That's right.
I was going to say you could use it for entry here into the ACSA Big House, and nobody will give you a second look on it.
That's right. My vaccine card and my ACSA card, right?
Exactly.
Dr. Bardach, testing lead on the Safe Schools for All team, State Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Bardach, it's been an honor to have you here on the show and your support throughout this. Best of luck to you, and we look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everything you do. Great to be with you guys today.
Edgar, I want to make a point here. A comment from Sarah Olson. Personally, I'm hearing my kid's school has families not reporting active COVID because quarantine is too restrictive and affects siblings and or close friends. The parents don't want the heat and restriction, so they are choosing to keep kids home without reporting. Are we seeing a downtrend in reporting? Let me just address Sarah's comment here, because I'm hearing exactly the same thing, that parents don't want to deal with the challenges of quarantine and don't want to have that look of they got COVID in the family, so all of them are going to have it. They don't want to deal with the image in society, if you will, so they're not reporting it. And this is going to lead to problems with the underreporting. We talked about the dashboard the COVID dashboard that districts have right at the top of the show. This has got to be a challenge, and certainly one that I know I'm experiencing. Edgar, I don't know if you're experiencing the same kind of thing or hearing the same kind of thing with your kids in their school district.
Yeah, no, I think this is an issue that I think there'll be more conversations about. Hence some of the even tweaks in the guidance about looking at the quarantine periods, what's appropriate. I've been reading some of the national, international news, in terms of some of the different approaches that folks are taking in terms of these strict quarantines when there is an exposure, right? We're talking to something different. Also, the difference between somebody's been exposed to COVID. Now, the real dangerous part, if this becomes a disincentive to even if your kid gets COVID and you don't notify them, right? Like I learned very personally, as I mentioned last week, my son tested positive for COVID a few weeks ago. And obviously I see firsthand what, the impact there is. Now, with that said, one of the good parts about utilizing the school testing programs that Dr. Bardach was talking about, like my son did, is that the school district had that information, took the appropriate actions, obviously got in contact with everybody. Now, this is an issue in terms of we don't want to go in the direction where now families are not reporting, potentially exposing others. So I think that's a policy conversation that's mixed in with some of the public health side. As the science evolves, what is the appropriate use of these quarantines, especially if this is the scary part, if COVID's going to be with us for some time, and this is something we're going to be thinking about and dealing with in schools in the long term, then I think there's going to be continued conversations about the appropriate use of them.
Yeah, I will step off my soapbox in just a moment, but I think I just feel like it's not responsible for everybody if you're not reporting this type of thing, no matter what society says. I mean, I swear, Edgar, every time I felt a little sniffle here and there, my immediate thought is, oh my goodness, I have COVID. But I mean, by not reporting it, you're certainly putting kids.
Just stay away from my office, Naj. When you have the sniffles, just stay on that side, please. I mean, I'm just,
I'll make sure that I stay on my half of the building. All right. Well, as I had mentioned, Edgar and I are just coming off of doing this show for the ACSA Virtual Personnel Institute. We had this here. So Edgar, I'm going to let you get out of your seat for the first time in a couple of hours. Good to see you, man.
Hey, always fun. We'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, folks, so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. You heard Edgar just say it. We're back on the air next week, live and interactive at 1 o'clock here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.